I, 29F, come from what you call an upper-middle-class family. My father was a successful real estate developer who built his business from scratch, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom who managed our household. I have an older brother, Edward, 34M, who was always the golden child in our family. Growing up, the dynamic between Edward and me was always strained. He got everything handed to him on a silver platter: the best education, connections through Dad's business partners, and eventually a cushy job at Dad's company. Meanwhile, I had to fight for everything I wanted. When Edward needed a car for college, Dad bought him a brand new BMW. When it was my turn 2 years later, I was told to get a part-time job and save up for a used Honda. The favoritism wasn't just about material things. Every achievement of mine was measured against Edward's. When I made it into the honor society, Mom just said, "Oh, that's nice, dear. Did you hear Edward just closed his first property deal?" It was exhausting living in his shadow, but I learned to deal with it by focusing on building my own path. I worked through college, taking summer internships at investment banks while Edward spent his summers learning the business by playing golf with Dad's partners. I graduated with honors and landed a job at Goldman Sachs, but even that wasn't good enough. Dad called it playing with other people's money and kept pushing me to join the family business. The real estate company, Davidson Properties, was Dad's pride and joy. He started it in his garage 30 years ago and built it into a $200 million business. Edward joined straight out of college and got fast-tracked to VP of operations within 5 years. Everyone knew he was being groomed to take over eventually. Dad kept trying to convince me to join too, but always in roles reporting to Edward. "Your brother knows the business," he'd say. "You could learn so much from him." What he really meant was that Edward needed someone he could trust to do the actual work while he played executive. I refused every time, which only created more tension. I built my own career in investment banking instead. It wasn't easy. I worked 80-hour weeks and climbed the ladder the hard way. By the time I made vice president at my firm, I was finally starting to feel like I'd escaped Edward's shadow. I even helped arrange financing for some major real estate developments, bigger deals than Edward had ever handled. But at family gatherings, all anyone wanted to talk about was how Edward was carrying on the family legacy. Things stayed tense but manageable until last year. Dad started having stomach pains that wouldn't go away. When he finally went to the doctor, they found stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It had already spread to his liver. The doctors gave him 3 to 6 months at best. The diagnosis changed everything. Dad immediately started putting his affairs in order. He'd always been meticulous about business, and this was no different. He called a family meeting and laid out his succession plan. Edward would become CEO of Davidson Properties, but ownership would be split 50-50 between us. "The business goes to Edward because he's there," Dad explained, "but you'll get equivalent value in other assets, the vacation properties, investment accounts, everything split down the middle." It seemed fair to me. Edward got the business he'd worked in, I got my share of the family wealth. But Edward completely lost it. He started yelling about how unfair it was that I'd get half when I'd abandoned the family business. He stormed out of the meeting, and that's when things got really ugly. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Edward spending a lot of time alone with Dad in the hospital. At first I thought he was just being a good son, but something felt off. Mom started acting weird too, avoiding eye contact when I asked about Dad's condition. I was busy with a major deal at work and couldn't be there as much as I wanted, which I now realize was exactly what Edward was counting on. 2 weeks before Dad passed away, when I was in London for a client meeting, Edward made his move. He brought a lawyer to the hospital and got Dad to sign a new will. I only found out about it after the fact. Mom later told me Dad was on heavy painkillers at the time and could barely hold the pen. The new will was a complete shock. Instead of the 50-50 split Dad had promised, Edward got 80% of everything. The explanation in the will claimed this was to ensure the stability of the business. Mom tried to convince me it was for the best, that Edward needed the resources more than I did. She even suggested I should be grateful for the 20% I was getting. I was devastated. Not because of the money, I had my own career and savings, but because of the betrayal. Edward had manipulated our dying father to get what he wanted. He took advantage of Dad's weakened state and medication to change a decision Dad had spent years planning. It was cold, calculated, and cruel. What really made my blood boil was discovering that Edward had fed Dad lies about me during those hospital visits. He convinced Dad that I was planning to sell my share of the business immediately after his death, that I would partner with competitors to take over the company, that I was just waiting for my inheritance to cash out. All complete lies, but Dad was too sick to verify any of it. After the will reading, Edward had the nerve to tell me this was what Dad really wanted. He suggested I should take my 20% and stay away from the business entirely. Mom stood there nodding along, just like she always did when Edward pulled his stunts. That's when I decided enough was enough. Edward had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I spent the next few months carefully gathering evidence. I got copies of Dad's medical records showing his mental state during those final weeks. I found emails between Edward and the family lawyer discussing the will changes before they happened. But the real goldmine came when I hired a private investigator. The PI uncovered years of financial fraud at Davidson Properties. Edward had been embezzling money through fake vendor contracts, inflated expenses, and phantom employees. He'd been living large on company money while preaching about preserving Dad's legacy. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The PI also found evidence of multiple affairs, including one with the wife of Dad's oldest friend and business partner. Instead of confronting Edward immediately, I decided to play the long game. I pretended to accept the will's terms. I showed up at family dinners, made nice with Edward, even congratulated him when the board officially made him CEO. All while building my case and waiting for the perfect moment to expose everything. That moment was coming soon, at the annual charity gala where all of Dad's old business partners would be present. Edward wouldn't know what hit him. Update 1: The annual Davidson Properties charity gala was everything I expected and more. It's a massive event held at the Plaza Hotel every year, where Dad's old business partners, major clients, board members, and family friends gather to celebrate and raise money for local housing charities. Dad started this tradition 20 years ago, and it was always his favorite night of the year. Edward spent weeks preparing for this event. He wanted to prove he was worthy of being Dad's successor, so he made sure everything was perfect. The theme was continuing the legacy. The irony wasn't lost on me. He even had massive portraits of Dad displayed around the ballroom, which made what I was about to do feel even more justified. I arrived early and sat at my assigned table near the back. Edward had deliberately seated me far from the main action, probably hoping I wouldn't draw attention. His wife Sarah was helping him greet guests at the entrance. She looked stunning in her designer gown, completely unaware that her perfect life was about to implode. Almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The evening started with cocktails and networking. I watched Edward work the room like he owned it, laughing with board members and schmoozing with clients. Mom was there too, floating around like the proper society widow, still playing her part in Edward's charade. I noticed she kept glancing nervously in my direction. She knew something was off but couldn't figure out what. Then came the moment that sealed Edward's fate. I overheard him talking to Richard Evans, one of our biggest clients, near the bar. He was bragging about how smoothly the succession had gone, how Dad had seen the wisdom in giving him control. He actually said, "Sometimes you have to help people make the right decision, you know what I mean?" While winking at Richard. That's when I knew I wouldn't hold anything back. The presentation was scheduled for 8 p.m. Edward took the stage, looking every bit the successful CEO in his custom tuxedo. He gave a speech about family values and continuing Dad's vision, standard stuff about integrity and legacy. Sarah watched adoringly from the front table, their perfect marriage on display for everyone to see. I had coordinated with the AV team earlier, claiming to have a special tribute video for Dad. They had no idea what was really on the USB drive I gave them. As soon as Edward finished speaking, the screens behind him lit up. The first slide was simple, the true Davidson legacy, followed by copies of Dad's original will showing a 50-50 split. Then came the medical records, showing Dad's heavy medication schedule during his final weeks. The emails between Edward and the lawyer were next, revealing their plot to change the will while I was out of town. The room got very quiet. Edward tried to signal the AV team to stop the presentation, but I'd paid them well to ignore any interruptions. Then came the financial records, fake vendor contracts, inflated expenses, money trails leading to Edward's personal accounts. Years of systematic fraud laid bare for everyone to see. Sarah's face went pale when the next section started. Photos of Edward with his mistresses, time-stamped hotel receipts, text messages arranging meetups. The worst was the evidence of his affair with Linda, the wife of Dad's oldest friend and business partner Tom. Tom was sitting right there in the front row, I made sure of that. The chaos that erupted was beyond anything I'd imagined. Sarah ran out crying. Tom lunged at Edward but was held back by other guests. The board members immediately huddled together in a corner, phones out, already calling their lawyers. Edward tried to play it cool, claiming it was all fake, but I'd made sure to have copies of everything ready to distribute. Mom's reaction surprised me the most. Instead of defending Edward like she always did, she stood up and addressed the room. Her voice shaking, she confirmed everything, how she'd watched Edward manipulate Dad in the hospital, how she'd stayed silent out of fear and habit. She broke down crying, apologizing to me in front of everyone. Edward finally lost it. He charged toward me, screaming about how I'd ruined everything. Security had to escort him out. By then, most of his mistress's spouses had also left, presumably to start their own confrontations at home. The board called an emergency meeting right there in a side room. Within an hour, they'd suspended Edward and frozen his access to all company accounts pending investigation. Sarah's divorce lawyer was already on the phone before she left the building. Tom promised to bring criminal charges against both Edward and Linda. I stayed until the very end, watching it all unfold. Various board members and business partners came up to express their shock and support. Many admitted they'd always thought something was off about Edward but never had proof. A few even suggested I should take over the company. Mom begged to come home with me that night. She couldn't face going back to the house she shared with Edward. She spent hours apologizing, telling me how she'd failed both me and Dad by enabling Edward's behavior for so many years. She's staying in my guest room now, finally getting therapy to deal with her years of enablement. The company's legal team reached out the next day. They're terrified of a public scandal and want to settle the inheritance issue quietly. They've offered to restore the original 50-50 split and add compensation for damages. I haven't decided what to do yet. Edward hasn't stopped calling and texting, alternating between threats and pleas for mercy. I've blocked his number on everything. His reputation is destroyed, his marriage is over, and his career is in shambles. Part of me thought this would feel better than it does. Don't get me wrong, I don't regret exposing him. He deserved everything he got. But I thought revenge would feel sweeter than this empty feeling I'm left with. At least Dad's legacy is finally in the open, all of it, the good and the bad. I know he would be devastated to learn what Edward did, but I also know he would have wanted the truth to come out eventually. The investigation is still ongoing, and I hear there's more dirt yet to be uncovered. I'll update again when I know more. Update 2: the last 2 months have been absolute chaos. The company's internal investigation uncovered so much more than even I knew about. Turns out my expose at the gala just scratched the surface of Edward's schemes. The forensic accountants found that Edward had set up a network of shell companies to hide money he was siphoning from Davidson Properties. He wasn't just embezzling a little here and there, he had stolen nearly $12 million over the past 4 years. Dad would have been heartbroken if he'd known. But the real bombshell came when they discovered what Edward was planning. He had been secretly negotiating with a competitor, Mountain Ridge Development, to sell them key properties at below market rates. In return, they would give him a hidden ownership stake in the new developments. These were properties Dad had personally acquired and developed over decades. Edward was literally selling off Dad's legacy piece by piece. The board called me in for an emergency meeting last week. They laid out everything they'd found and made me an offer. They would restore the original 50-50 inheritance split if I agreed to join the company as Chief Strategy Officer. They needed someone with both real estate knowledge and financial expertise to clean up Edward's mess. They also wanted me to sign an NDA about certain aspects of Edward's dealings. Apparently some of them could trigger investigations into other companies too. I was ready to refuse. I had built my own career away from Davidson Properties, and I was doing well. But then Sarah reached out to me, and everything changed. She came to my office looking completely different from the polished executive wife I remembered from the gala. She was barely holding it together. That's when she told me she was 4 months pregnant. She had found out just a week before the gala but hadn't told Edward yet. Now she's stuck dealing with him for the rest of her life because of their child. Sarah showed me documents she'd found while moving out of their house. Edward had been planning to strip the company's assets and then file for bankruptcy, timing it so he could hide assets from both the divorce settlement and company creditors. He didn't care that this would destroy the jobs of hundreds of employees who had been loyal to Dad for decades. That was when I knew I had to take the board's deal. But I made my own demands, full audit powers, the ability to reverse any deals Edward had made in the past year, and a seat on the board. They agreed to everything. They were that desperate to avoid more scandal. Mom's still living with me, but things are complicated. She's struggling to process everything that's coming out about Edward. She keeps saying things like he was such a sweet boy and I don't know where we went wrong. I try to be patient, but sometimes I want to scream at her that she knows exactly where they went wrong. They spoiled him rotten and never held him accountable for anything. The therapy seems to be helping her though. Last week she finally admitted that she had seen warning signs about Edward's behavior for years but chose to ignore them. She said she was too afraid of losing her comfortable life to stand up to him or Dad. At least she's being honest now. Edward tried to fight back, of course. He hired some hotshot lawyer to claim that he was set up, that I had fabricated everything out of jealousy. But the evidence was too solid. The board's investigators had found everything independently after my gala presentation. Even his lawyer dropped him when the full scope of his fraud came to light. Sarah's divorce is moving forward, and she's made me her key witness. She's determined to protect her baby's future inheritance from Edward's schemes. The judge has already frozen most of his remaining assets after seeing evidence of his planned bankruptcy fraud. I'm slowly learning the details of Dad's business that I had stayed away from all these years. Turns out I have a knack for real estate development when I'm not being pushed aside or undermined. Some of Dad's old partners have started reaching out, saying they always wondered why I wasn't more involved in the company. The hardest part has been dealing with the employees. Many of them had looked up to Edward, believed in him. Finding out about his betrayal hit them hard. I've been trying to rebuild their trust in the Davidson name, but it's going to take time. I know there's more to come. The investigators say they're still finding new evidence of Edward's schemes every day. I've heard rumors that some of his shadier deals might attract federal attention. I'll update again when I know more. Update 3: The dust has finally settled, and things have fallen into place in ways I never expected. The company is stable now, and last month the board unanimously voted to make me CEO. Turns out I inherited more of Dad's business instincts than anyone realized. We've managed to reverse most of Edward's damaging deals and even landed 3 major development projects that he had nearly lost. The federal investigation into Edward's dealings wrapped up last week. He's facing multiple charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. His lawyer is pushing for a plea deal, but from what I hear, he's still looking at significant jail time. The evidence trail was just too clear. Edward made one last desperate attempt to worm his way back in. He showed up at my office unannounced last week, looking nothing like the polished executive he used to be. He'd lost weight, his designer suits replaced by off-the-rack clothing. He brought Mom along, thinking she would help plead his case. His timing was awful. We were in the middle of a board meeting. He burst in claiming he had changed, that he understood his mistakes now, and wanted to make amends. He even offered to take a junior position in the company, anything to get back in. Then he played his final card. He started talking about how Dad would have wanted the family to stick together. That's when Mom surprised everyone. She stood up, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Your father would be ashamed of what you did to this company and your sister." She told him to leave and never contact us again. The security team had to escort him out while he yelled about family loyalty. It was pathetic but also strangely liberating. Sarah had her baby last month, a beautiful little girl named Claire. She asked me to be the godmother, which felt like the ultimate victory over Edward. He's not even allowed unsupervised visits with his daughter. The judge saw his history of deception as a character issue. He's required to pay significant child support from what's left of his assets, but he can't make any business decisions about his remaining shares without board approval. Mom's still living with me, but she's different now. The therapy has helped her understand how her enabling behavior contributed to everything. She's started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping other women who stayed in bad situations out of fear or dependency. Sometimes I catch her looking at old family photos with tears in her eyes, but she's finally standing on her own. The company's thriving under the new management. We've restored relationships with clients who had been wary of dealing with us after Edward's fraud came to light. Dad's old business partner Tom has become a mentor to me, saying he wishes he had seen my potential years ago instead of just following Edward's lead. Some family members, especially on Mom's side, still think I went too far with my revenge. They say I could have handled things privately, that exposing Edward publicly was unnecessarily cruel. But they don't understand, this was never just about the inheritance or even the business. This was about years of manipulation, favoritism, and abuse of trust. I don't regret anything. Edward made his choices, and now he's living with the consequences. The company is stronger than ever, Dad's legacy is secure, and for the first time in my life, I'm not living in anyone's shadow. I sleep just fine at night knowing that justice was served. Sometimes karma needs a little help, and I was happy to assist. This chapter of my life is finally closed, and I'm ready to write my own story now.